Thank you all. So we have officially filled the room with education champions. And you know, the key to our success in the collaborative labs is to get the right stakeholders in the room. And we've done that because you have committed to being here with us over the next 3 days. So thank you. And I know we've just scratched the surface, but we do have such a strong foundation of successes, don't we, as we just heard? And I'd like to introduce you to Milo Page. I'm going to introduce you to our blue team here in a moment. Milo will be facilitating with me over the next 3 days, and I know he's captured some key takeouts of the strengths and successes that you've shared this morning.
Okay, thank you, Andrea. And listening to everyone sharing examples of strengths, I became more and more impressed with how we're putting into place a foundation for the work that we have to do over the next 2.5 days. Just as an example, we heard that there's a strength in having state standards that are consistently applied. We heard that there's a strength in adopting or embracing a data-driven mindset. And we heard that play out in a couple of different ways. For example, the state standard assessments, those are data that give us a chance to compare year to year how we're performing. Teacher evaluations are data that can be used very instructively to recognize teachers who are doing well, to help those who need help. We also heard that school grades are also a piece of data, and we heard an example where they can really get attention. So there's the strength in the data-driven mindset. We heard about the strength of constantly ratcheting up where we're going, and the strength of being focused on the future, because the future is constantly changing. And we heard that you either improve or go backwards. So all of those are strengths. One more strength is the diversity of viewpoints that we have here in the room. And we also heard there's the strength of don't hold back. We've got a process here that honors all viewpoints. And at the same time, we're going to ask all viewpoints to honor the process. Here's what I mean by that. Over the next 2.5 days, we have an opportunity to collaborate and produce a work product that meets what Governor Scott has asked for. This process is in constant motion. And I'll give you an example here. We are about to introduce presenters from the Florida Department of Education who will give us some briefings. These are briefings for action. And so what we're going to ask is, you may have questions and answers, you may have points to discourse or discuss. We're going to ask you to take those points into your group teams to collaborate, because that's where they're going to do the most good. Also, the presenters will be here for the balance of the day, so if there are questions, we will be able to loop back and answer them.
So we will get to our presenters here in a moment. I'd like to also introduce some other team members. We have Joyce sitting quietly over here on keyboard, and she captures all of the wisdom that comes from the room. So we prepare for those of you, and by the way, how many of you have ever experienced collaborative labs before? Please raise your hands. So you know the potential and what we can do together. So Joyce is capturing this dynamic process in a real-time record, which will be the most robust, meaningful meeting notes you've ever seen, and that will come to you on Thursday. So we don't want to miss a beat. We'll be able to get to work right away. And that's Joyce. And then PJ is our technology guru, and he also takes your picture. Just get used to it. Just smile really big whenever he comes around. And he'll be driving our technology. We have software that accelerates some of your best thinking. So that's PJ. Steve, also in the back, is our technology guru. He'll be helping us. If you could raise your hand, Steve. And you've already met Alan, who's our business development officer. And we have over in this corner Jonathan, and he is our business illustrator, our visual orchestrator, and he will take the best of what you all determine as our future and put it in a vision mural. So for those of you who are visual people in the house, this will speak to you. You'll say, yes, that is the future. That's what we're building together. So we begin with the end in mind in the collaborative labs, and he will put it in a vision mural that will be there to remember forever. It will be in our real-time record as well. So that's our team. And I'd like to share with you our objectives for the day, and for tomorrow, and for Wednesday. So today's objectives. You've just completed mission number 1. Well done. You've introduced yourselves. You've shared some of the key strengths. Please continue to infuse those into the process, our strengths, our successes that we can leverage as we build our ideal future. The next order of business, after we hear our presentations, will be to review guiding principles that Governor Scott has lifted up for us to refer to as we go through our process. And then we will culminate today with being visionaries. So we will envision the ideal overarching vision for our education accountability system. And we'll take into consideration all 4 of our focus areas. What are the areas of alignment and integration? So that will be our final activity for today. Then tomorrow, we will focus on 2 of our strategic areas. State standards will be our focus for the morning, and then state standard assessments for the afternoon. And our 3 orders of business tomorrow for each of these areas will be to develop ideal visions for each, to identify issues and challenges as well as potential solutions to address. And then for each of the focus areas, we're going to look at possible potential next steps. And so that is for tomorrow. Then when we come back on Wednesday, it will be a similar process, just 2 different focus areas. School grades and teacher evaluations will be our focus. But again, the same outputs, which would be to build ideal visions, lift up any challenges or issues as well as potential solutions, and then to build next steps for our ideal visions. So you have those in your agendas, and that's our next order of business. So at this time, we would like to introduce our first presenter. And I know that we have handouts that will be coming your way, so stay tuned because we'd like you to be able to follow along with our handouts. Marla?
Okay, and our first presenter is Deputy Chancellor of the Florida Department of Education, Mary Jane Tappan.
Good afternoon, everyone.
We can hear you.
I'll have my teacher voice. Is that okay? My role today is to provide you the background of state standards. I come with a view of a former teacher and lifelong educator, a parent of students' children who went through the initial implementation of Sunshine State Standards and FCAT, and Principal Bill Mumford led them through that as high schoolers. But I also have a grandson in the system. He's now a 5th grader, and we talk about the standards and we talk about instruction. And I remember calling him a perfect square when he turned 9, so he knew he could do well in mathematics. So it's a very personal issue as well as professional issue for me. So with the history of standards in Florida, directly after Florida passed the first Education Accountability Act, and this was actually the first state in the nation to do so, we identified minimum student performance skills. About a decade after that, you probably remember several documents that were about the state of education in the United States, and that led to the development of new standards. The State Board of Education took a look at them, and they approved curriculum frameworks in 1985 and an updated set of minimum standards. Then more research about the state of education in the United States brought forth, a decade later, another iteration based on not just the performance of students in the United States, but comparison of student performance across the world and across the country. So we set new performance standards, which were then called Florida Sunshine State Standards. And probably many of you are familiar with the Sunshine State Standards that were adopted in 1996. After that, more research. Another decade later, the state commissioners attended a meeting and heard the research on student performance in the United States, how it compared to the top nations in the world, and a new set of standards started to be developed. In 2007, in Florida, we began the next generation Sunshine State Standards development process. And at that same time, the Common Core State Standards, the conversation among state leaders took place, and the beginning of the development of the Sunshine State Standards. The Common Core State Standards. So what are standards? and what is required. In state law, it requires the State Board of Education to establish the standards that specify the core content, knowledge, and skills that our K-12 students and our public school systems are expected to acquire. They are the what. Each school district must provide all the courses and appropriate instruction designed to ensure that students meet these standards. So standards are not curriculum. The standards describe the what, the content that students need to learn. However, the local level determines the how. Curriculum instruction define the how, and those are determined at the local levels, at the district, at the school level, and in the classroom. So why standards? Back in the early 90s, there was a lot of frustration and acknowledgement that all students did not have access to quality content in the classroom. In fact, we had some subgroups of students where the data indicated they were not performing at the level of other students. So the standards movement began, and the purpose was to provide equitable access to children from classroom to classroom. Why should we change our standards? Research on the state of standards in 2008 provided this information to our state leaders, that countries were not only outperforming our students on international assessments, but they were outperforming even our best and brightest students. Top performing countries not only had higher, more rigorous standards, but they had fewer standards per grade level. And the economists report that there were stronger foundational skills that were necessary for our economy to succeed, particularly in mathematics and reading. And that our high school graduates, not just in Florida, but across the country, leave us, and a high percent of them require remediation when they enter post-secondary and the workforce. Florida's response to this research was the development and implementation of a next generation standards development process. In fact, it was placed in law in 2008. And the requirements when Florida develops new standards is to first look at the research. What are the top standards in the top states in the nation and the standards that the top nations of the world? What does that content look like? The process has to be guided by renowned content experts. Who are the experts in the field nationally? They should guide the development of Florida's standards. The writers of the standards should include post-secondary experts, experts in the field, and by that I mean if we're working on mathematics standards, it should include mathematicians. If we're working on science standards, we should include scientists and educators. And I will tell you, as part of the development of the Sunshine State Standards, we did not have scientists and mathematicians at the table, and we did not have renowned experts external to Florida at the table. So this was a huge improvement in the development of standards for our children. It also required a review and comment by educators at all levels, leaders in business and industry, and the public. Prior to adopting any set of standards in Florida, we have a public review. And that public review, in some sets of standards, we have thousands of folks writing in and commenting on the set of standards that are up for adoption. The results with this next generation process has been very highly rated next generation Sunshine State Standards. And in those standards, we have fewer concepts per grade level, providing for more in-depth instruction, which has confused some, but let me show you a chart. First, David Coleman. David Coleman grew up in the New York public school system. He went to Yale. He was a Rhodes Scholar and went and studied British literature. He was a lead writer for the Common Core State Standards. He's now the president of the College Board. He said, when we look at other countries, they work harder, or the assumption is they work harder, the children work harder and longer than we do, they work on everything, and our kids may be a little bit more creative, but there's no way they'll ever do this much hard work So we might as well fold up our tents now. But what is actually happening is these countries are focusing on fewer things, doing them better, doing them well. Here's an example. We have our former Sunshine State standards that I personally was on a team helping to write, so I can take all of this personally, but I don't. As you'll see, I was an 8th grade math teacher, and I had 93 concepts to cover. And I use that term purposely, cover. We raced through content, getting them ready for the test. And we covered content, and if the students couldn't keep up, hopefully they had access to a tutor. The Sunshine State standards were a great start. But what we learned is you can't cover and provide in-depth instruction at the same time. Students need to have differentiated instruction and time to learn. So we developed the next generation. You'll see the numbers in mathematics, the next list. We went very far from a mile wide and an inch deep to fewer concepts and in-depth, maybe a little too far. You'll see the results of the Common Core. Still, a much smaller average of number of concepts per grade. Those of you who have children in this system, many of you talked about that. This is a reasonable number of concepts for a teacher to teach, yet time to differentiate instruction. So the Common Core results are over in the left-hand column. So why should we make a decision to include the Common Core in our state standards? Well, there was a lot of discussion about this, but let's list some of them. The benefits to students. We have close to 100,000 dependents of military in our state, many military bases. These children move from state to state, classroom to classroom. So a benefit is when those families move from Alabama, down to McDill, their parents can be assured that the children have the same standards. We also have a very high mobility rate in Florida, in our Florida schools. Equitable access to high quality content. We want to make sure the students sitting in an 8th grade English language arts classroom in Union County have access to the same content as those sitting in Miami-Dade. Standards that demand higher levels of critical thinking and problem solving. A key difference between the Common Core and the next generation is the child's requirement to defend their solutions, to find evidence in the text, to prove like we used to in geometry. Maybe some of you aren't as old as I, but I used to have to do proofs in geometry, and then proofs went away. Well, guess what? Now logical thinking is back. Nationally and internationally competitive academic performance, to be able to compare the performance of our children to those state to state, but also the rest of the world. And recognition of that achievement across our borders, so that post-secondary institutions, companies that hire our children have a good sense of what they've accomplished when they graduate from high school. The benefits to Florida, the economies of scale, education resources. If we have 46 states pulling on the same resources, if you have a 3rd grade teacher and they're having a hard time teaching a concept, they have resources from across the nation to pull on. Assessments. We have FCAT. FCAT's a great assessment. We love it. It's one of the most rigorous and top in the nation. But you can't compare FCAT data to the Texas test or to the California test. Instructional materials at the local level. Instructional materials are a heavy lift, very expensive, hard to access. They're much easier to access when there are a lot of free instructional materials at your fingertip, because we have thousands of teachers across the nation finding the best, most up-to-date content, as well as those that are purchased. And again, the comparison of our student data. So when the Common Core development process started, there were these following requirements. First, aligned to college and career and work expectations. This is the first set of standards that I've been involved with, where we started with the end in mind. What skills should that high school graduate have? How do we get them ready for that? So they started with college and career. What are the skills that our children need to be successful when they leave us? That they be clear, understandable, and consistent. They include rigorous content and application of knowledge. They build upon the strengths and lessons of our former standards. They're informed by the top performing countries and our top performing states so that our children can compete in our state, in other states in the United States, but also internationally, and that they are evidence and research-based. So resources used in the development of the mathematics and English language arts Common Core state standards, again, nationally respected state standards, and Florida was one of those lead states. Florida's standards were used as one of the resources for the writers. Internationally respected national standards. What do the standards look like in those top performing countries? State's Department of Education, Florida was a lead state. I remember having the privilege of being involved in many of the preliminary discussions back in 2008 and 2009 regarding the importance of moving in this direction. Scholars, assessment developers, professional organizations, educators at all levels, parents, students, and the public. So again, thinking of the end in mind, Common Core State Standards Initiative, the following criteria guided the standards development. College and career readiness. The Common Core State Standards define the rigorous skills and knowledge in English language arts and mathematics that need to be effectively taught and learned for students to be ready to succeed academically in credit-bearing college entry courses and in workforce training programs. That was the beginning of the development. How Florida participated in the development of the Common Core State Standards. Remember how I shared the next generation process that was put in law in 2008 for Florida? I remember sharing that information with the writers of the Common Core, how our process evolved, who was included. Particularly, they asked me about how we got public input. The process, the next generation process, Florida's next generation process guided the development of the Common Core. Leadership by Florida, experts, content experts. We have one of the top reading experts in the nation in Florida. She was heavily involved. Florida standards were cited again as resources. We had multiple face-to-face meetings. Drafts were available. The PTA joined us in support. We had public review, and again, a public review period of time where 433 Floridians provided comments directly to the developers of the Common Core. So here was the tipping point from my point of view. We have, as several of you said, and I'm very appreciative of your comments, very highly rated next generation Sunshine State Standards. Fordham did a rating of all the standards right after the final draft of the Common Core came out. Florida was one of the few states in the nation where we had standards as highly rated as the Common Core or comparable to the Common Core. In fact, our mathematics were rated A, Common Core A-, our English language arts B, Common Core B+. They said these were too close to call, very comparable. Some different strengths, our next generation mathematics were very clear and concise. The Common Core require modeling with greater focus on conceptual understanding, proof of solutions, and I have many, many examples on that. In English language arts, the Common Core, they require more writing and providing evidence to support responses. So I think you'll see the word evidence and defense a lot when people talk about the Common Core. Common Core state standards, again, are in the content areas of English language arts and mathematics, grade levels K through 12. Emphasis on English language arts includes reading, writing, speaking, listening, and language. Students who are college and career ready, the end in mind, demonstrate independence, build strong content knowledge. There is a much stronger focus on academic language in the Common Core English language arts standards. They respond to varying demands of the audience. They comprehend as well as critique. They value evidence. They use technology and digital media, and they understand others' perspectives. Emphasis on the Common Core in mathematics, number and quantity, algebra, functions, modeling. Modeling is one section that was not included in the next generation. Geometry, statistics, and probability. So a college and career-ready student in mathematics makes sense of problems and persevere. Perseverance is one of the key standards in the Common Core mathematics. Reason abstractly and quantitatively. They construct viable arguments, critique the reasoning, model with mathematics. If a student can draw a model of the mathematics or use software to build a model of the mathematics, their conceptual understanding of what they're doing is far greater. Use appropriate tools, attend to precision, look for and make use of structure, and look for and express regularity in repeated reasoning. So what do they look like? What does Common Core really look like? So let's compare next generation and Common Core. So next generation, the student effectively applies listening and speaking strategies. Common Core, the student will ask and answer questions about information from a speaker, offering appropriate elaboration and detail. This is a third grade writing standard, a comparison of next generation to Common Core. So if you'll think about the difference between those two skills. In mathematics, next generation, use and justify the rules for adding, subtracting, multiplying, dividing, and finding absolute value of integers. The first one is a pure mathematics standard. The Common Core standard is where they distinguish comparison of absolute value from statements about order. For example, recognize an account balance of less than negative $30 represents a debt greater than $30. And that's a 7th grade Common Core 6th grade. So the difference here is one is a pure mathematics, the second is the application of that same skill. Technology. You've heard a lot about technology and more emphasis on the use of technology. Here are some examples. Going through the Common Core state standards, here is kind of a progression. Starting in kindergarten with guidance and support from adults, using a variety of digital tools. Again, I go back to my grandchildren. They can outdo me on any digital tool you put in front of them. Beginning in grade 3, using search tools. Someone mentioned Google earlier today. Beginning in grade 6, audio, video, live versions, integrate information presented. It's really talking about presentation skills. And 9 through 12, using technology, including the internet. There's a thread of research throughout the English Language Arts Common Core. Here's an example just in writing. Grade 4, type a minimum of 1 page in a single sitting. Now, if you think about that, if a child's writing on a wide ruled piece of paper with their pencil, they can fill that page up with few words. When you talk about formatting a digital piece, unless you allow them to use a font of 48 or something, they're going to have to use a lot more words, far greater formatting skills, and keyboarding skills. By grade 6, type a minimum of 3 pages. When I talk to teachers about and principals, if their kids are here, they all nod their head. They are not here yet. Shifts in technology and mathematics. The use of calculators, spreadsheets, computer algebra systems, statistical packages, or dynamic geometry software. This stuff's been around for a while, but we really don't see enough of it in use in our classrooms yet. Grade 6 is really the first grade where there's a standard that is most appropriately taught using some type of software, such as a spreadsheet or geometry software. So we're not talking about starting to use calculators in 1st or 2nd grade to add or subtract. They need that conceptual understanding. They need to build their understanding of facts prior to that. But starting in 6th grade, we should see the use of software and mathematics tools to do mathematics. Florida's adoption timeline. In 2008, again, the Next Generation Standards process, which was the process used to build the Common Core. 2009 to 2010, Florida participated as a lead state in the development of writing the Common Core state standards. 2010, Florida received a final draft early 2010 for the public and for educators to review. In June of 2010, the State Board of Education was provided that final draft, and in July of 2010, it was adopted by the State Board. Our implementation in the classroom, 2011, 2012, we began with kindergartners. Juan Coca's daughter was in kindergarten, I believe, that year. 2012-13, kindergarten and first grade. So that means in English language arts and mathematics, their instruction has been the Common Core. 13 and 14, that's this year. So Common Core state standards in English language arts and mathematics in K1 and 2. And what does that B stand for? Our test this year is still on the next generation. So we have a blended course description. Remember, the State Board provides the standards. Locally, they determine how to implement them, the curriculum, and the lessons. But the content has to include the Common Core state standards and the next generation that are left that are assessed, that not are part of that Common Core. And finally, next year, all Common Core, again in English language arts and mathematics, with assessments to assess the standards that are being taught. And you can see in 13-14, instructional materials in K5 on the Common Core have already been adopted. And in 14-15, we'll have 6-12. And locally, they can determine what to purchase to teach and implement these standards. So, as one of your guiding principles, the draft, continuing to raise the bar in education standards by including an emphasis on critical and analytical thinking to drive continuous improvement by Florida students. That's a discussion you'll have later today, if that's the mission that we want to have and the guiding principle we want to have regarding standards. So that's my brief overview of the history of standards in Florida. Vince Burgess is following me with a history of state assessments in Florida. And if you'll just give us a second I'll give him the mic.
Thank you.
That's 45 now. There was 47 and 47 there. All of it.
Hey, good afternoon. While you're getting next set of presentations, I'll just give you a little bit of background about myself. Actually got my wings at Pensacola Naval Air Station way back in 1989. Served during the first Gulf War, and I lost my hand in ejection, so if you see my fingers don't look quite the same, I'm one of the first owners of a bionic hand in the world. So, after I left the Navy, I was retired, I became a school teacher. I taught in Taylor County, Florida, taught mathematics all the way through AP Calculus. I was a school administrator there, assistant principal at elementary school. And during that time, I was able to help serve on the committees that, first of all, reviewing the first generation of standards. Then I also helped review the test questions for FCAT and also help provide the scoring material to score the performance tasks back when we had that for FCAT. And I've worked for the department on assessments in some fashion since 2005, and I became the director of assessment in July. So there's my quick, brief history, but I also want to mention that my two daughters came up through the public school system. I've got a high school senior right now. I've got a third-year student at the University of Central Florida, and my wife's a pre-K teacher. And neither one of us would have each other's jobs. So come from an assessment family. I'll give you a brief presentation. I don't intend to cover the entire universe of assessment here. Just a little bit of a flavor, a little bit of background, and talk about some things as we've heard from the public and others, concerns about assessments. I'll try to talk about some other possible, some options for assessments. Again, we won't have all of the advantages and disadvantages, but I'll cover some. if you want to discuss in your breakout sessions, we can certainly do that. We can, again, hold questions again until we get to those breakout sessions. So like Mary Jane did, we'll talk about some of how the assessments came to be. So obviously, a long history, beginning at 1969 with NAEP, the National Assessment of Educational Progress. Educational Accountability Act of 1971 started the statewide assessments. 1976 was the landmark case Deborah P. versus Turlington. So that's the first time that we had assessments as a graduation requirement. But for those of you who don't know, Deborah P. versus Turlington was a case that had to do with students having the opportunity to learn the assessment material before being assessed and held to accountability standards for it. Because of that case, the delay was from 1982-83 when it was finally put into place. We began a writing assessment in 1992. This is when I started to get involved, 96, 98, FCAT started. We had 3 grades. Students were assessed once in elementary, once in middle, once in high school. In 2001, we had FCAT in all grades in reading and mathematics, 3 through 10. 2002 was the first time that students were retained in grade 3 if they didn't meet requirements. FCAT Science in 2003. The fall retake in 2006 was the first time that Florida used computer-based tests. And even today, we continue to develop more assessments to be administered online. We're adding 2 additional grades and subjects this coming year. 2011, FCAT 2.0. Of course, we changed from the Sunshine State Standards to the next generation Sunshine State Standards. And as you heard the commissioner say, and as you heard Mary Jane say, of course, when you change standards, you need to be measuring what it is that you're teaching. So since we changed standards, we changed assessments. Also had added end-of-course assessments in Algebra 1, 2012, added science, FCAT 2.0 science came aboard, 5, 8 in biology end-of-course exam, geometry. This past year, in the spring, U.S. history was the first in the course. The commission might have been at standard setting and reactor panel for setting scores. Oh, yes, and Patty Owl was there as well. So Patty Hightower, she was there with us as well. And then 2014, this year, takes us to the civics end-of-course assessment. So there's where we go. And then with the Common Core state standards coming aboard, we're looking forward to assessments that are aligned to those standards. And again, some of this you've already seen. For, as the commissioner mentioned, for moral, legal, and ethical reasons, we want to have an assessment that is aligned to the standards. We want to measure what you teach. We want to provide information to students and parents. Are students on grade level? Have they mastered the standards? Teachers need to know, have my students mastered the standards? It's also a way to make sure that if the teachers know that there's standards here, we've got an assessment that's aligned to all of the standards, that we know if the teacher teaches all of the standards, not the test, if the teacher teaches the standards, then they'll master the assessment. I think I heard that borne out in some of the comments as we went around the room. Obviously, we need a test that provides the information for our state accountability system. This was an important point. I want to remind folks of this. I think now this is probably the 3rd or 4th time you've heard it. Florida's 3rd graders, we have grandchildren and children. 3rd graders now have only had Common Core state standards. By 2014-15, that'll be all they know. Lots of things here. These are important points that I'll talk about many of them or most of them. As you have your breakout groups, we definitely encourage you to think and discuss, and we want to hear all of your ideas, how these pieces, some of them are in tension with each other. Obviously, we're going to look for an assessment, whatever we choose to do, that is aligned to the standards. We want meaningful information for parents and teachers. We want those reports on time. Valid and reliable for all of the purposes we use them for, not just for student promotion, retention, teacher grade, school accountability, and so forth. We want the test to be quality. We talk about tasks worth doing. If there's modeling, if a student's supposed to cite evidence and show that they understand what they read and be able to write coherently, we want a task that reflects that. Now, if we want something that measures student achievement. We want something that measures all of the standards, all of the full range of student performance. That test might take some time, right? So then we have to also think about testing time. We can't have an infinitely long test. So there's a little bit of a tension there. Same thing with cost. As you may know, Machine score tests are fairly easy to administer and score, and they're fairly cost effective. For some of the standards, we know that multiple choice items are possibly not the best way to assess those standards. So if you have items that are required to be scored by human beings, that's where potentially the vast majority of the cost can come from, scoring that test, and using, again, human scores. You also need to think about assessment. We talked about a lot of good reasons to have technology-based assessments. Well, technology-based assessments for every school on day one of the assessment across all the grades. There may be some concerns with districts. It's not just having the number of devices, having the support staff, having bandwidth, having the infrastructure within the school. That's very costly and is a high requirement. So you need to think about an assessment option that might provide you with some paper-based options at certain grades. Some of those, so there's another consideration. And then finally, if it's Common Core state standards, you would think you would have some kind of assessment or some kind of comparability with your scores to those of other states. And the more the better, the more comparable, the more information that you're going to get. So again, lots of things to consider. And again, you've got to weigh the benefits versus the risks of having, trying to meet all of those, or the ability for you to meet all of those. Again, this is not the entire universe of possible options. These are just some highlights of some of the things that we consider. So for your standards assessments, obviously PARCC. For those of you who don't know, the Partnership for Assessment of Readiness for College and Careers, it's a consortium that's funded through federal Race to the Top dollars. This development work is led by contractors, much like our own current assessment work for Florida assessments, and reviewed and led by states as well. Nationwide field testing is scheduled for this fall, this spring, and then next spring, 2015, we have operational tests. So go ahead and mention field testing. Florida is in a position to field test if we so choose. And, you'll hear some other states in the coming weeks. We'll start announcing some schools and districts. Again, Florida still making decisions. Obviously, some of this discussion here might inform some of that. So we do have time. We want to keep this in position because this would give us the opportunity to think about if we truly want to think this is one of our options. If it's an option, we can consider field testing that keeps it open for one option while you look at other options. Another potential is a custom assessment designed by Florida, could be developed by contractors like we do now, overseen by the department, reviewed extensively by Florida educators or solely by Florida educators. You would want field testing for use in operational assessments. And finally, you can think about a shelf or a semi-shelf product. So for those of you who aren't in the assessment parlance, if you think about a test like the SAT-10, something that you buy off the shelf for some purpose, you don't have any say in how it's developed or reviewed, but you can purchase it in a fairly cost-effective way and administer it. There might also be the possibility of a semi-shelf product. There might be some vendors out there that might have some products that you might be able to somewhat customize to meet your needs, testing time, cost, and so forth. We do know that some states are trying to buy some of these products or intending to. Oklahoma last week just released a solicitation for such a product. We know of other states that may release what's called a request for information, looking to see what else is available out there that might meet their needs. So of those three options I'll run through, again, this is not the universe of advantages or disadvantages. You may think of some, but I just wanted to point some here out for you. So advantages for PARCC. Florida K-12 and higher ed faculty, department staff have been key contributors all throughout the process. Not just from the standards, but leading right into the assessment development work. We've led the way. There have been more Florida educators and department staff involved in the PARCC board than from any other state in the consortium. External validation of the item quality to this point, and a high degree of alignment. When I say a very high degree of alignment of items to standards, I'm talking about those kinds of tasks. If the standard calls for this, PARCC tasks are being developed to do that. I've been involved in a lot of that work. We have other folks that have involved in that work as well, so we've seen it. I'll stop right there and say there are lots of the things that I'm speaking about, and you'll say, where did you get that from? We'll have resources in the coming day, and we can get you links to these documents that provide this information. We'll have it all for you. Looking for timely and meaningful reports. As we talk about the standards, the economies of scale. So we'll share some costs, sharing the management of the work, sharing the development of the items, sharing the technical support that goes on there. We probably have to pay for our own hand scoring. I don't think Rhode Island would like to assist us with that. So we would share some costs. We'd also share the national expertise that's out there. Importantly, results from a park assessment can be compared to the other states that are in the park consortium. There will be a paper-based option available for the first year, we know. There are some disadvantages. We have a link on our website to the comparison as we currently know it. Now, we won't know the exact park testing time until after field testing, but our best estimates from what park has provided and from what we have shows that there's about twice the testing time, additional testing days, as compared to APCAT currently. And of course, tests are a bit longer as well. Costs, Park did release some estimates of costs. Their cost estimate was based on 100% computer-based testing in every classroom across all grades. And also was based on all of the states were in the consortium at the time that the costs were calculated, carrying over to this calculation. So we do know that Florida would like to look at an option that has paper-based testing at some grades, which will increase costs. We do know that there are fewer states now, for example, Georgia and Oklahoma, Indiana now have all withdrawn from the consortium, or they won't be involved in the assessment, so that's fewer states to share those costs. Again, paper and pencil, we would like it and think it may be an option, but we're not guaranteed that paper and pencil will continue to be an option for park assessments. And then some of the folks have talked about concerns over the federal involvement. As I said, Park Consortium is funded through Race to the Top grant. And because they've approved the design, that initial design was approved by the federal government, and as changes have been tweaked and made, the federal government, the U.S. Department of Education has had to approve those changes. So some folks may see that as a drawback, although the grant, that input ends when the grant ends in late 2014. The park timeline is on track. There are, from the very early days of park, we talked about some of the considerations to think about. There's the additional, if you're working with a consortium, there's the additional aspect of how that's governed. What's the purchasing process look like? It's been done with other consortia, but that's just an extra step, another thing to think about for us to work with. How do we do that with other states on such a grand scale? Talk about custom assessment. Again, we talk about this just because this is the way. Why can't we do it, or can we do it like we've always done it? Obviously, lots of advantages to doing it this way. We have a long history of quality assessment for the past peer review, customized to measure the standards in the way that we feel they need to be measured. But we do have the capacity to continue to do this work with robust and professional staff with a long history of experience in this. Timely and meaningful teacher reports that are completely customized for Florida. Again, Park has extensive engagement by Florida. I mentioned that. And if you build your own assessment, that means you own all of the reviews, you own all of the input on all of the scoring and reporting. More control over cost and testing time. You can specify that in whatever procurement document you put out. Same thing about technical qualities, that ensuring the strength of the assessment as a measurement tool. So we think about, can you create a new scale to go from FCAT to FCAT 2.0? If you develop your own assessment, you can think about changing that scale into this new scale. You're going to have to set standards again. So you have total control over that as well. Standard setting. With the park assessments, park would determine what college and career ready is, but if you use the park assessments, the state would also control what passing or a promotion standard would be. We would do that. Here we would control all of the standard setting. We would control not only promotion and the graduation requirements, we would also control that college and career ready setting for our own assessment. And technology requirements, if we wanted to say we shall phase in assessments on this schedule, we could say that. And then a paper-based option, again, we would require that to meet our needs, and we could tell them what technology we'd like to use. Some of the disadvantages of that, however, you could say we might have some comparability because we are assessing the Common Core state standards, but the ability to say how you compare would be reduced in this kind of scenario. Same thing Mary Jane talked about. We would continue to want the best experts in the country to help us develop the assessments and tweak them and make them better. A technical advisory committee is very important to the work. And we have great folks on our TAC committee, but with a consortium, you have access to more of that expertise. and again, reduced purchasing power. So the development of a very robust assessment of lots of good, high-quality items. Those will be expensive to continue to develop and maintain on your own. Finally, that shelf or semi-shelf assessment. If other states choose to use that same product as you, you can compare with those other states. Maybe not as many as PARCC or the rest of the country, but you've got other states you can compare your results with. You could require, if there's additional development to be done, you could say, well, we want Florida educators to be part of the reviewers, we want them to score the items. You do have some control over cost and testing time, depending on what shelf product that you select. Again, you could also require some paper-based testing options, and then again, you require timely reports with meaningful information. Disadvantage is we frankly just don't know what's out there. What's out there. Again, we know if another state releases a request for information, we can get that information. We do know that there's been little or no field testing within Florida. We do know that for a 2014-15 test, we wouldn't have had educators with input into the items in the development and design. Not to say that we couldn't have that input later, but to start off, we wouldn't have that ownership up front. May have less control over standards, so we talked about that. Again, we would set a graduation and promotion requirement. That would be a non-negotiable. As far as what other measures or what scale that you're going to use, that might be something that you have to compromise with the other states that are using it or the owner of the product. Again, comparability with states and the sharing of costs depends on how many are going to adopt it, that scale. If it's lots of states, lots of savings. Fewer states, fewer savings. And then the technology, you can say what technology that you like, but what's out there, again, you just don't know. So lots of question marks there. So moving forward, we do know that whatever assessment that we choose, we're going to want an assessment that replaces FCAT, that does these things for us, that it accurately measures the mastery of the standards, timely, meaningful information, and they've got to be cost effective. And it's worth mentioning that we want to make sure that whatever we choose doesn't have the federal fingerprint on it that we've heard people discuss previously.
Since you list the PARCC disadvantages, which are significant, the other consortium is Smarter Balance. Do we have any peek into what's going on over there in terms of what they're doing? Are they further ahead? Are they further behind? Do they still have the same disadvantages with testing times and paper and pencil?
There's lots of the same considerations and disadvantages. I'll say this one thing. The additional piece of it would be we've had no input into any of their design or development. So we can talk about that certainly when we break out tomorrow. I think that's an important thing to make sure that we discuss, and I'll be prepared to speak to that more fully. With that, I would like to turn it over to Jane Fletcher, who's with the Department's Accountability and Research and Measurement Group.
Someone just went over to get us. Just learning something. A lot of questions. A lot of questions.
Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you all. I'm going to segue from... Am I on now? Yes. Okay. I'm going to move on from the assessments to one of our uses of the assessments in the accountability system. This is one of the places that we use those assessments to try and look at measuring the success of schools. And I'm going to talk a lot about what we're doing now to try and make sure that we're all on the same page in terms of some fundamental information about how our school grades model works. And then I'm also going to take some time to talk a little bit about the history of how we got here. How did we get to where we are now? One of the fundamental questions that comes up is, why do we grade schools? Why is it important to do that? Well, one of the things that Senator Thrasher referred to in the beginning when he created the A+ system was they were trying to find a simple way that people would understand what's going on at an individual school. When you see an A and you see an F, everybody knows what the difference is between those on the surface, right? And so that's how the community that Juan talked about was rallied around to know what the difference was between this school that was graded A and this school that was graded F. So then it's our responsibility to make sure that the metrics that underlie that grade give the accurate picture of what's going on in that school. So it gives clear information to the parents, to the community, to the students on how their school is doing. It was the first time that we put in place high-stakes accountability for the adults in the system. We've always graded our students, right? Students have always gotten grades on tests, gotten grades in classes, but this is the first time we've ever had grades that reflected on the adults in the system. So Florida's grading system. Right now, it looks at three main things. It looks at the performance of students. How are students achieving in that school? It looks at the learning gains of the students. Are students moving forward? If they're starting near the top, are they continuing to progress? If they're starting near the bottom of the scale, are they still continuing to progress? So it looks at both where we are and where we're going. The other thing that our system does is it focuses attention on the students who haven't been doing as well. And are we focusing attention there and moving them forward? Because that's one of the places we really need to focus, is on the kids who have been struggling, who need extra support in order to move forward. And then the other thing that our school grading system does currently is it provides rewards and supports. For schools that increase their grade and schools that are graded A, they're eligible for school recognition funding. And then for schools that need support, schools that are graded F or schools that are graded B, there's the differentiated accountability system that goes out and provides support to those schools to help them make changes in what they're doing to better serve the students in the classroom. Because after all, this is about the students. In addition, our model has been a model nationally that other states have used. Since we began school grades, other states have decided that that's a good idea and have adopted school grades models on their own. Some states have adopted school accountability and they haven't called it school grades, it's been ratings or rankings or other things. But some other states have done grades, and everybody does it a little differently. But the same process is trying to get information out there on how our schools are doing. Okay, now I'm going to start on the model. This is a picture of the basis, sort of the basic, that underline school grades for each of the different types of schools. All of the schools, whether they're elementary, middle, or high, have this part of the model in their calculation. So you see across the top, there's reading, math, writing, and science. And those four components are in all of the school grades model. And that represents 50% of the points in this basic model. So there's 800 points total, and 400 of them are in those four areas. And this is looking at the performance of the students. It's how well are they performing? Are they performing on grade level, or are they not performing on grade level? In the FCAT that Vince was talking about, we have 5 achievement levels, and level 3 and above is satisfactory on grade level performance. So you're going to hear a lot of talk in this about level 3 and above. So if a student's at level 3 and above, we consider them performing satisfactorily. Now, if you have a school that has 27% of its kids scoring at grade level, they're only going to get 27 points in that reading cell. Conversely, if the school has 80% of its kids performing at grade level, they're going to get 80 points in that cell. And it works the same way across for each of the subject areas. Then the learning gains is the other 50% of the model. You have learning gains in both reading and math. The first two learning gains are for all students. So we look at all students in the school to see if they're making learning gains from one year to the next. Are they increasing to the next achievement level? Are they making a year's worth of progress from the last year to the current year? And then we also have another piece that's focused on the learning gains of the students who are struggling the most. We look at the lowest 25% of students in the school. That's to make sure that our school is focusing on the kids who need the most help. And so that's the top 50% on performance and the other 50% on learning gains. That's the basic model, and you'll see that reflected as I go on to each of the models for the different types of schools. This is the elementary school model, and you see that it's almost exactly the same as the basic model. It has the same components, it has the same 800 points, it includes FCAT information, and it includes information on students who take the Florida Alternate Assessment. Now, the Florida Alternate Assessment is for students with disabilities for whom the FCAT is not an appropriate assessment. So this is the appropriate assessment for these students. And those students are also included in this model. You can see in addition to the points that were in the basic model, there's some bullets at the bottom. So in addition to the points, there's some other pieces of the school grades model that come into play. For example, schools need to test at least 90% of their students in order to get a grade. If you didn't have a criteria here, we might have kids that weren't tested, that should have been tested, and the grade might not reflect the performance of that school. So we have to make sure that the data that we're working with really is all the kids that are at that school, and that the grade really shows the true performance of that school. Another component that's in addition to the points is a new component for last year, and it's the reading performance threshold. Schools need to have at least 25% of their students performing on grade level in reading, or their school grade is lowered by 1 grade. The state board used that 25% threshold as a metric because pretty much everyone can agree that you need to have at least 25% of your kids reading on grade level. And then the other additional requirement is there's a learning gains requirement. And so this looks at the overall learning gains for the school, and it looks at whether at least 50% of your kids in your school made learning gains or a year's worth of progress in a year's time this year. And you need to show that either this year or last year. And if not, then your grade can be lowered. And that's the model for elementary schools. Now for middle schools, it's the same basic model, except on the right-hand side, you see another column for acceleration. Now, this was put in legislation a few years ago, that in the middle schools, in addition to the regular model, we're looking at whether middle school students are taking high school courses that have EOCs. This is like Algebra 1, and geometry, and biology. So this looks at students that participate in and perform successfully on those courses. And schools have an additional 100 points, 50% for participation and 50% for success. And this is to encourage middle schools to have the students who can be successful in these courses move on and take high school courses to accelerate their progress. High schools. Now this model looks a little bit different. The left-hand side is the same, basically. It has the same picture, it has the same 4 components across the top, and it has the same learning gain points. And it's the same 800 points that you've seen before. But there's more components on the right-hand side. In 2010, for the first time, high schools were graded on this different system. And it includes other components that are not in the other models. The first one, 50% of the points are on the left-hand side, and 50% of the points are on the right-hand side. So the first component on the right-hand side is acceleration. And that looks at the participation of students in courses like AP courses, IB courses, dual enrollment courses, national industry certifications, ACE courses, things that will move students forward towards college and career. This whole side is really focused on, are we getting our students in high school ready for college and career? So in the acceleration column there, we're looking at participation, which is, do they participate in these courses or assessments, and are they successful? Do they earn college credit in that AP course based on their exam? The next column looks at graduation rate. And in the graduation rate, we're looking at all kids in the high school's graduation cohort and the percentage that graduate within 4 years and the percentage that graduate within 5 years. We have 2 measures there. In addition, you'll see an at-risk measure. And that is similar to our low 25 in that we're focusing on the students who are most likely not to graduate. This is a cohort of students who in 8th grade were scoring at level 1 or level 2. So when you come into high school and you're already scoring at level 1 and level 2, there's a concern about whether they will be students that graduate. And so this is providing a little more focus to look at those students and make sure that we're graduating them. And so that at-risk component is added. And then the last component on this other 50% side of the model is college readiness. And this looks at the percent of students who graduate on time in that 4-year cohort, looks at the percent of them that are college ready in reading and in math. And that's measured based on ACT performance, SAT performance, PERT, or the CPT. And so it's a percentage amount. And all of those components together make up the high school grade. Remember, it's 50% on the assessment side and 50% on the other component side. One of the questions we get asked a lot is, why are high school grades released in December? There's always questions about that. And the reason is because of that blue part of the model. That information is not available in the summer. It's not available until the fall. And so that's why the high school grades get released in December. Grading scale. So you saw that the schools are getting points in each of those areas. For example, the elementary schools had a total of 800 points. And there's a scale, and it looked to translate from points to grades. So if you get 66% of the total available points, you can earn an A. If you get 50% of the total available points, you get just barely a D. So you can see the point scale up there, and you can see that the different types of schools, because of the different components in the models, have a different number of total points. But the same percentage applies to each of that total number. So elementary schools have to get 66% of their points in order to get an A, just like high schools and middle schools do. We've been talking about school grades, but there are other school accountability mechanisms, namely the school improvement ratings. And school improvement ratings can be used by alternative schools or ESE centers. Now, alternative schools are schools that could be a traditional school, could be a charter school, but it's a school designed to provide an alternative placement for students who aren't being successful in the regular school. ESE centers are designed for students with disabilities who can't be appropriately served in the regular school. And in both of these cases, those schools can choose between receiving a school grade and receiving a school improvement rating. If they choose to receive a school improvement rating, the school improvement rating is constructed differently than the school grade. It focuses on learning gains only. It looks at the learning gains in the current year and compares that to the learning gains of those same students in the prior year. And it looks at whether those learning gains are increasing, improving, whether they're decreasing or declining, or whether they're staying basically the same. And there's only 3 ratings: improving, maintaining, or declining. Now, we've talked a little bit about where we are in the current system. Now I'm going to go back and talk about how did we get here. Well, one of the things I said in the very beginning is that Florida has a long history of school accountability. Basically, it started in 1991 with Blueprint 2000 and the Accountability Commission. We've got some folks here who were around then. And in that system, it started the whole school improvement planning process. And as part of that process, schools had to develop self-reported indicators that they would use to measure their progress, and they had to report on whether they met those indicators. And that was a system of accountability for the schools, and it was locally driven and developed at each individual school. However, it was very different from one school to another. And so there was no sort of cohesive standard or measure that we were applying to all the schools. And so that system developed into the next system, which was the critically low performing schools. And in 1995, we began identification of critically low performing schools. And this was a system that looked at reading, math, and writing performance, and it looked at whether schools met what was determined as a critically low level of performance. And it used 2 years of data. And if a school was below that critically low level on reading, writing, and math for both of those 2 years, then they were determined to be a critically low performing school. Then in 1999, we began the school grading formula. And it began using FCAT results for the first time. It was based on current year data, not based on 2 years of data. And it includes performance in reading, math, writing, and it also includes some other criteria, such as dropout rates, attendance, and discipline data. It looked at minimum criteria, which were kind of similar to the critically low performing criteria, but it also had higher performing criteria. And in order to get an A or a B, you had to meet those higher performing criteria. And in order to get an A, you had to meet higher performing criteria and criteria related to the dropout rate and attendance and some of those other metrics. Then in 2002, the school grades calculation was changed to the points-based system that we now have today, which had 50% on performance and 50% on gains. Learning gains was added then, and learning gains, they looked at changes in performance in the old system, but really didn't look at learning gains until the system in 2002. Learning gains were added for both reading and math, and learning gains looking at the low 25%, those students who needed the most support and attention in reading, was added in 2002. Then in 2005, we added students with disabilities to the learning gain calculation, and these were students with disabilities who were tested on the FCAT, not the students who had the alternate assessment that we talked about in the current model, but just the FCAT students. And English language learners were added to the learning gains calculation. In 2007, science was added when we had the new FCAT science assessment. And then learning gains for the low 25 in math were added. to the school grades calculation. In 2010 is when that other side on the high school model was created, the blue cells on the high school model. So that's when we had 50% on assessment and 50% on other measures. In 2012 is when we had a lot of changes because we had new assessments. We had FCAT 2.0 and we had end-of-course assessments that came into place. And so anytime when you have new standards and you have new assessments, it changes how you do some of the calculations and what the standards are that schools would be evaluated on. In that same year, students with disabilities and English language learners were included in the performance measures. English language learners after they've been in the country for a year, and students with disabilities, all students with disabilities, not just those on the FCAT, but also students with disabilities who take the sort of alternate assessment. Also in the high school side of the model, on the other side, we included the new graduation rate that Florida is using, the federal uniform rate. And we also started using some weighted learning gains. Now in this area, in the learning gains model, what they were doing was giving schools sort of added weight or added credit when low-performing students in levels 1 and 2 made progress greater than you would expect. And so they got extra credit for that. And they also gave schools extra credit when they moved students into levels 4 or into levels 5. So it was working on both ends of the spectrum to move lower performing kids higher and moving other performing kids into the highest levels. And then in addition, in 2012, the state board enacted a safety net provision because there were so many changes and because the changes were coming late in the year. They provided a safety net which limited the amount that a school's grade could drop to one letter grade. Then in 2013, we had new assessments in science, FCAT 2.0 science, and geometry and biology, EOC assessments coming into the school grades model. The safety net provision was continued in 2013, and the reading threshold that I talked about earlier was implemented for the first time. And that brings us up to the current part of the school grades model. So one of the things that you've noticed, or you've probably seen as we've been going through this, is that the school grades model has undergone changes and over time, tweaks and changes to include more students, to include more assessments, to address issues that people had with the calculation to try and make it as fair as possible. So one of the things that you may have noticed over time is that we're including more and more students as we go through. When we began, we were only including students in 4th, 8th, and 10th grade, because that's all that we assessed. And we were only including reading, writing, and math, no students with disabilities, limited English language learners. But now, schools are held accountable for more of their students, grades 3 through 10, plus the end-of-course assessments. Reading, writing, math, but also science and end-of-course assessments in high school. We're including students with disabilities fully in not only learning gains, but also in performance, and also English language learners after they've been here a year. And then the focus on the lowest 25% is something that's been added into the school grades model. So what does it all mean, and what has it done? Has it had any impact? This is a slide that looks at student performance over time. You see it starts out in 2001 with the FCAT performance. That blue line is level 3 and above, that's grade level and above. And you can see that in 2001 it started out at 47%, scoring at 3 and above. And then in 2010, which was the last year of the FCAT, it was up to 62%. So there was a marked increase in student performance over that time. You see that green line? That's where we changed tests. We went from FCAT to FCAT 2.0, and the standards were reset. And you see that. You see the bar was raised for the standards, and performance went down initially. That red line, that's achievement level 1. You can see how much that's gone down. It started out at 32% of students at achievement level 1, went down to 18% at the end of FCAT, and with FCAT 2.0, it's now down to 17%. And that was reading. Now the next slide is math. This is math, the same thing, the same basic picture. 3 and above on math started out at 50%, went up to 68% in 2010 on FCAT. Achievement level 1 started at 29% and went down to 14%. You can see the same difference when the new standards come in. The standards are more difficult. There's a lot smaller percent of kids scoring at 3 and above, and a somewhat larger percent scoring at level 1. So moving on from here. There are some changes that are already in rule that are set to take effect in 13-14. The U.S. history assessment, the law requires that the U.S. history assessment be included in the school grades calculation, and it's designated that it be included in the other 50% side. So it will be included in the model next year, and it will be in there at 100 points. It will reduce the number of points on the acceleration measure by 100, so this will be 100 and acceleration will be 200.
Can I ask a question? I'm sorry. Why take it away from the acceleration side? Why not keep it on the FCAT performance side? That just doesn't make sense. It's not fair.
It's the way the law is written. The U.S. history, sorry. The U.S. history is in a separate part of the law from the other assessments. And so in that part of the law is designated as being on the other side of the calculation.
You do see, though, that you're taking away from those schools who want to encourage AP participation. Because now, perhaps we could talk about it more.
We can talk more. There are additional changes that will likely go before the state board in October. There are rule revisions to implement changes to statute this past year. For example, in statute this last year, they changed the cell size in the school grades calculation to a cell size of 10. This is in an effort to ensure that more schools are graded. And they also established criteria for how co-located schools would be graded. These are schools that are at the same physical location. In addition, there will be a revision to the percent tested calculation to comply with the ESEA requirements. And then there's also a proposal to extend the one letter grade drop provision through the 14-15 school year. So moving forward, these are the tenants, the 4 tenants laid out by the governor's office moving forward, and things that we should consider. Thinking about the changes that have already been made to the school grading formula over time, and changes to make it even better going forward, how we can continue to ensure fairness, transparency, make sure that it's meaningful and useful information for people, for parents, for educators, for students, and ensure that we continue to include the bulk of our students in the calculation.
Thank you, Janie. To all of our presenters. Is it time for a break?
Yes.
Yes.
I just believe that Common Core, the blended curriculum, works well within the classrooms. I've used it in my class for the past 2 years, and my students have excelled and produced from it. So using the blended curriculum helped them to actually think critically.
Oh, okay. All right. Thank you.
Thank you.
Good afternoon, everybody. Nice to see you all awake now that you had a chance to stand up. This is the last one, so if you can hang in just a few more minutes, that would be great. Again, I'm doing history as well as everybody else did. and I'm here to talk about the history of educator evaluations in Florida and where we are now. There are a couple of milestone years in evaluation history in Florida, and there was one in 1999. So I'm going to start with what we were doing before 1999. And many of the things that were happening in evaluations, at least how they were set up by district and those sorts of things, are the same as they are today. And so before 1999, every district was responsible for implementing its own evaluation system, and that is still the case now. The department's responsibility was to review and approve the district's evaluation system for its instructional personnel. Why do I say that instead of saying teachers? Because instructional personnel includes classroom teachers, but it also includes guidance counselors, library media specialists, and other folks that are responsible for student learning that are different from administrators. Evaluations were required once a year for each employee, just as they are now. And their purpose in law was to be designed for continuous quality improvement of educational services. Just as today, just as the law says now, back before 1999, we still had to have evaluations that were based on sound educational principles and contemporary research and effective practices. Parent input was included, just as it is now, as districts choose to do that. And each district was required at that time to make improvements in an evaluation system each year. At that time, evaluations were applied to instructional personnel, we talked about who they were, to school administrators, which includes principals, assistant principals, and other school leaders, and then also to supervisors. So what were the criteria back at that time, before 1999? The criteria really were in two parts. They were listed separately, but you can think of them in two parts. Those criteria that are listed on your screen in green have to do with things that happen in the classroom or relate to classroom instruction. Ability to maintain appropriate discipline, knowledge of subject matter, planning and delivering instruction, evaluating instructional needs, and communicating with parents. Those are the 6 main tenets of the evaluation system. And then there was an opportunity for districts to add other professional competencies or if the state board passed rules on such things. Then beginning in 1999, there was a new criterion added to the evaluation system. I should say at this point that prior to 1999, before Florida made this change, there was just starting in the 90s research on teachers and teacher effectiveness, as we call it now. Everybody had said for many, many years that the teacher was the most important thing in the student's academic life, just as many of you said earlier today. But in the 90s, there were researchers such as Dr. William Sanders, sometimes people call him Bill Sanders, out in Tennessee and North Carolina, who started to look at research and actual student data to measure the differences in teachers' effectiveness and the actual impact that teachers had on student learning. So while that was going on in the 90s, in 1999, Florida had to change in how it evaluates teachers and principals in its evaluation systems. They were still owned by each district, the department still reviewed the instructional personnel system, all those same things were the same, but there was a new criterion added of performance of students. If you remember what Jane was just talking about a few minutes ago, what Vince was talking about, you've seen the history of accountability of student assessment in Florida, and so the evaluation system is really keeping pace with those same changes. So beginning in 1999, how did we define this new category, this new criteria of performance of students? Well, at that time, the law said that evaluations had to primarily, that was the word it used, primarily use data and indicators of improvement in student performance, and is measured by 2 things, state or local assessments. In 99, as you remember from listening to Jane and Vince talk, as we were beginning the new system of assessing students every year, with EPCAT, there was some caveat language put around that evaluation system. So once we had that system of measuring learning gains every year on an annual basis, then they expected that this information would be included in teacher and principal evaluations. Then in 2002, after that system had been away for a few years, the caveat language went away, and that became the expectation. One other thing I should mention is during this time, lots of other things were happening besides the research on teacher effectiveness is being done by researchers around the country. Florida also entered into statutory requirements for performance pay. And in 1997, the first language went into law that said teachers should be rewarded based on how they perform on their evaluation system. So it linked performance compensation directly to evaluations. And then in 1999, that language was modified to clarify that really it should be about a 5% supplement that teachers who are rated outstanding should receive if they were rated outstanding on the evaluation system. So at that time, it linked performance compensation directly to the evaluation system. Now, I've jumped an entire decade all the way to 2010. Why did I do that? Well, that was the next big change in the evaluation system. But as you know, many things were going on in Florida between the time I just left 1999 and 2010. I mentioned performance pay just a minute ago. Performance pay took on lots of different forms during that decade. What happened in 2005 is the legislature asked the State Board of Education to review district performance pay systems. Remember I said they were linked directly to the district's evaluation system, and the evaluation system was supposed to be primarily based on how students were learning, on state and local assessments. Well, the State Board did a review of district performance pay systems, and it turned out many were having a hard time implementing performance pay. Not because they couldn't necessarily set aside the money for the 5% supplement. Some had a struggle with that too. But mostly, the difficulty was with the actual evaluation system that underpinned the performance pay system. Very few districts were actually defining primarily the way we think of primarily now. And there were many district evaluation systems that didn't hardly use any, if any, student performance data in the system. And so from that, we had performance pay systems such as STAR, Special Teachers Are Rewarded, the Merit Award Program, which is a voluntary performance pay system that went into effect, a little bit separate from the evaluation system, but looking very similar to those two parts of the evaluation system. We look at how the students perform and how the teachers are evaluated in their classrooms by observations. Then, in 2010, all of this came back together with the Student Success Act. Instead of having separate performance pay systems from the evaluation system, then we began with the Student Success Act, which really took everything and brought it together once again. And it started with a new purpose for evaluation systems. We didn't drop the continuous quality improvement. That still remains in the law. That's still a really important reason to do evaluations. But in addition to that, it says the evaluation system is really now supposed to be designed to support student learning growth. And that's a key difference from previous years. It also still links the evaluation system to school improvement, individual professional development. And so now you're starting to see a picture, instead of having several different systems out there, now we're starting to bring all those systems into one spot. Continuous feedback, continuous improvement in student learning growth in one place. One of the things that I said was going on in research was about how students perform relative to the impact of their teachers. One of the things that happened also just before this legislation was passed in Florida is that there were reports published called the Widget Effect. The Methods of Effective Teaching project started with the Gates Foundation, and they were talking about a call for new kinds of evaluation systems. Evaluation systems that did those things that are codified in the Student Success Act, such as continuous feedback for teachers to improve, looking very carefully at student performance data, those kinds of things. And so when the Student Success Act passed, it included that same kind of information that you saw in those reports. It also did something else, those reports, that was very important, which is differentiate performance. Because in the old systems, the only two designations we had were satisfactory and unsatisfactory. A district could choose other categories besides satisfactory to rate teachers, and some did. But the law just contemplated satisfactory and unsatisfactory. So at the time we first started collecting data, which is just a few years, I think 3 years before we had the Student Success Act, most of the teachers in the state were reported as being rated satisfactory. There was no distinguishing among teacher performance, at least not through the evaluation system. In fact, the percentage was 99.97 satisfactory. There's very little information teachers are receiving through that system at all. So now the new system under the Student Success Act has 4 different performance categories. Highly effective, effective, needs improvement, or for teachers in their first 3 years of employment, developing, and then unsatisfactory remains as it was. And there's an important piece in the law that says the State Board of Education is supposed to establish student program standards for each of those performance levels, and it requires the commissioner to collaborate with educators and other experts in setting those performance levels. So what are the criteria? We saw the 3 categories before. We have 3 categories still under the Student Success Act: performance of students, instructional practice or instructional leadership, and professional and job responsibilities. I broke the green area out a little differently. Those 6 things that were there before about appropriate discipline and all that, that was actually one of 4 different lists of things that teachers were supposed to know or be able to do, either represented by different rules or different laws. And so that when I said earlier that the Student Success Act kind of brought everything into alignment for this purpose, it also did the same thing here. Florida has had the Florida Educator Accomplished Practices since 1997. And in 2011, the commissioner at that time had a teacher task force, and he brought those teachers together along with a working group from teachers and educators of different kinds across the state to look at those educator accomplished practices and update them with the most contemporary research. And so when the Student Success Act was passed and said that instructional practice should be based on the Florida Educator Accomplished Practices, all those other confusing lists of things that teachers are supposed to know and be able to do were deleted, and then there's one set that people can see and teachers can see. Notice I have a slash between instructional practice and instructional leadership. Since prior to '99, we've had evaluations for teachers, instructional personnel, school administrators, and supervisors, but there were never separate criteria in the law for school administrators, just those same 6 things I mentioned earlier. One of the other things the Student Success Act did was it actually recognized the unique role of the school principal and the school administrator. And it made very clear that in addition to the Florida leadership standards, that there are supposed to be indicators in that evaluation system of how well that principal actually supports effective instruction and effective teaching in that school. So we saw how performance of students was defined prior to now, and now here's how it's defined. It's still based on it's still annually assessed, and it's still state or local assessments. That hasn't changed a bit. That's the same thing since 1999. But now we call it student learning growth. That's the standard. It's important to measure how much progress students are making each year. And the assessments that the law refers to, those same state and local assessments, those are the ones that students are already taking in their classes. And those assessments are aligned to the course descriptions that Mary Jane was talking about earlier this morning, which talked about the standards. So using those same assessments that students take to determine their mastery of content of the course, that same information should flow into the evaluation system. It shouldn't be different things, it should be the same things. The other thing this law elaborated on a little more about performance of students is to look at learning growth over 3 years of students assigned to the teacher or principal. Not just 1 year, but 3 years. Remember, I talked about research going on. There's a lot of research out there that talks about measuring the value that teachers and the impact that teachers have on student learning growth. Much of that research says that it's best, when you can, to look at data over time. So if you think about 3 years of students that a teacher teaches and looking at how those students over time progress, then that's a much fuller picture of how a teacher performs than taking a snapshot of 1 day on one test. So you're now looking at how teachers taught over 3 years of time instead of just 1 year. Now, not every teacher is going to have 3 years worth of data. There are a lot of first-year teachers out there and things like that. So the law does say that instead of defining it as primarily, the law says you should use 50%, at least 50% of the evaluation should look at student learning growth. And if there's a teacher who doesn't have that 3 years of data, then the district can lessen the importance of that particular criteria on the evaluation outcome, down to 40%. So now we do have a standard across the state, instead of primarily being identified or defined differently by every district. The standard is 50%, or down to 40% in the absence of 3 years' worth of data. There's some other local flexibility in the evaluation system. Districts can also choose sometimes to measure achievement instead of growth. I know the law says that the standard is to measure growth whenever you can, but there are some assessments that don't lend themselves to measuring growth. There are some industry certification tests that are just pass-fail, and it's really not possible to measure growth on a pass-fail test. And so there are times when a district can say, well, the best thing we ought to do in this case is measure achievement. How many students earned the industry certification, for example? And those are decisions districts can make. They can also combine state and local assessment data depending on the teacher's teaching assignment, or for the principal, all the grades included in that school. And when it comes to determining which of these assessments will be used for purposes of teacher evaluation and principal evaluation, the law laid out a timeline for districts to follow. And it said the districts have until July 1, 2015 to determine all of those assessments that will be used for purposes of evaluation. So let's talk about learning growth a little bit more, make sure we're on the same page with that. We talked about state assessments, and we talked about locally determined assessments. When it's a statewide assessment, the commissioner is supposed to approve a learning growth formula so that everybody consistently is using that same formula for measuring student learning growth, if it's a statewide assessment. If it's not a statewide assessment, if it's an assessment the district has chosen itself to use for one of the other grades and subjects, then the district can choose which growth formula it should use to measure. And again, as I said earlier, a district can choose to use achievement instead of growth for certain courses. The department does have a role in this and to provide districts examples and technical assistance of growth models that can be used for those local assessments, but the final choice is the district's. So what is the formula the department uses that's chosen? What has the commissioner chosen for a statewide assessment? So far, there are two assessments that have approved state growth models. Recently, Algebra 1 has been chosen, but the one we've had now for 2 years running has been the one associated with FCAT. Florida uses a value-added model as a formula to calculate student learning growth for purposes of educator evaluation. When you're talking about courses, again, that are linked to FCAT, English Language Arts and Mathematics courses in those grade levels. It is part of a multifaceted teacher evaluation system because the law does indicate that districts should be looking at multiple data sources. The FCAT model was actually developed by a committee of educators and education stakeholders. This is one of the things that makes Florida a little bit different than other states. There are many other states that now have growth models, whether it's value-added or student growth percentile, they use in educator evaluation systems. Florida is leading this work, but it's not the only state by any means that's doing this work. But Florida's process was unique. We didn't hire an expert that already had their own model. We didn't choose another model that another state was using. We did actually convene a group of 27, primarily teachers, but other education stakeholders, superintendents, school board members, parents, business, and higher education, and district administrators, the Student Growth Implementation Committee. They began meeting in 2010. And they began meeting just for this purpose of looking at growth models for purposes of teacher evaluation. Remember, the commissioner has to consult with experts and educators in doing this work. And I will always be very proud of all the work that they did. Every meeting they had, the videotape of that meeting is still on the website. You can watch every minute, every second if you want to. All the materials are still there. All the transcripts are still there. Everything is there. Because we wanted it to be clear, this wasn't done just in Tallahassee. It wasn't done by we didn't just pick up somebody else's model off the shelf. This model works with our assessment, and it was developed by those educators in conjunction with some experts in growth modeling. So they recommended a model to the commissioner that the commissioner adopted, and that model accounts for factors outside the teacher's control that can influence learning and doesn't rely on a single year of data or a single test score. Remember, districts have the option to use achievement results if they want to in their local assessments, but the standard for using state assessment data and evaluations is to measure growth over time. And because this committee looked at this very carefully, you can look back at their discussion points, There is learning gains that we already have. There's a measure of learning gains already in school accountability that James discussed with you earlier. They took that into consideration and determined that this was really being done for purposes of an individual teacher's evaluation, and they selected that model based on those criteria. So it takes into account other things that can influence student learning outside the teacher's control. So what are some of those things that it does take into account that actually level the playing field among teachers for purposes of individual evaluation? You can see there are characteristics of students that are taken into account, because teachers get students from across the state, from across the world that come into their classrooms. Students' disability status, English language learner status, attendance, gifted, mobility, meaning are they in and out of school a lot during the year? Those transitions make a difference. Difference from modal age, what does that mean? Sometimes students are retained, sometimes they're accelerated, and those things can make a difference. Class size, homogeneity of students entering test scores, what could that mean? That means many of the teachers on the committee wondered and had a concern about whether or not teachers who had students who of the same type of performance level, maybe I have all high-performing students, or I have all low-performing students. Does that matter? Or does it matter if I have a mix of students in my class? So they looked at the data, turns out it can matter, and that was included as a factor in the model. And then there are school characteristics. There are very big differences in school performance across the state. Many of the schools do very similarly, but there are some schools that are very high growth schools, meaning the students grow a lot, looking at the assessment results every year, and some schools that are struggling. And those are things in the school that can influence student learning outside of what the teacher can control in his or her own classroom. So that's taken into account. Now, what does it mean that it's taken into account? What does it mean to have that factored into the model? Well, it turns out one of the things that we have, of course, we've been administering, as you heard from Jane and Vince, we've been administering the FCAT for a number of years. And so we know how students typically perform on FCAT by grade and by subject. And these students that have these characteristics sometimes perform differently. They grow more, or they grow a little less, than other students who start in the same place they do on that assessment in the prior year. And since we know that information, that's how this information is factored into what's expected of those students when they're assigned to that teacher. And so the differences in how those students do every year, those are all reflected back on the teacher's contribution to student learning, and that's how that score is measured. And the most important characteristic is actually the one at the very top, the prior performance. Speaking of research again, if you look at the research out there on whether it's the value-added model, whether it's student growth percentile, whichever one you look at, the different states use in their evaluation systems, it's most important to have a really good prior year score. That's a really good predictor of how the student's going to do on that assessment the next year. It's the biggest predictor. All of these other things do matter, and they can matter to an individual teacher who's being evaluated, and that's why they're included, because it can matter to an individual teacher. But the most important factor to look at when you're trying to measure growth is the prior year score. And in fact, our model includes 2 years of prior scores for each student. Adds even more information. So one more update, I should say, on evaluations. Student Success Act passed in 2010, and there was another bill that was passed just this past session, Senate Bill 1664, and it clarified a couple of things in the evaluation system. Remember I talked about performance compensation earlier? Clarified something for that too. Didn't make the non-classroom instructional personnel, remember I said instructional personnel, are made up of classroom teachers and library media specialists, guidance counselors. All those folks in that instructional personnel umbrella that are not in classrooms assigned to students, those folks districts can look at their evaluation results and their student performance data and decide what is most or best represents their contribution to student learning. And sometimes that's test scores and sometimes it's not. And then it clarified too the performance salary compensation. And districts set forth their performance salary schedules in a couple of years. They wanted to make sure that if teachers, remember that date back July 1, 2015, the districts had to decide which assessment data they're going to use for evaluation purposes. If districts hadn't decided for some teachers yet what they were going to use for evaluation, then those teachers could remain on the grandfathered performance salary schedule. They wouldn't have to move to the performance salary schedule because their evaluations hadn't been quite fully developed yet. So it takes that into account. There are a number of things that we've talked about, whether in the evaluation system or in performance compensation, where the law recognizes that districts are in different places in implementing new evaluation systems. This work is quite challenging. It's very difficult, it's rewarding, it's the right thing to do, as you've seen the law state. But it does take time. And while those things are being implemented, there are safety nets and things that can be done to mitigate the impact on teachers. So where are we now? What's next? I mentioned to you performance compensation was coming. And I mentioned to you evaluation systems are being fully developed. So over the next 2 years, there are a few dates to remember. In the 14-15 school year, districts are to determine which local assessments are going to be used for students to demonstrate mastery of course content for each one of the courses they offer. That's outside of teacher and principal evaluation. That's just for purposes of the district offering a high-quality assessment system and making sure students are mastering course content for each course they offer. Then after, that's the 14-15 school year. In the 15-16 school year, that July 1, 2015 date comes and goes, and school districts have to determine from all those assessments that I'm using in my courses that students take to master content, which ones of those am I going to use in my teacher and principal evaluation systems? Those decisions have to be made and implemented in the 15-16 school year. Now what about performance compensation? How does that calendar work? By July 1, 2014, every district has to adopt a performance salary schedule. They keep their grandfathered salary schedule, and they adopt a performance salary schedule. Some teachers will be on the grandfathered schedule, and some will be on the performance salary schedule. During the 14-15 school year, once that plan is adopted, the teachers who are going to be on the performance salary schedule will start to qualify for the salary they'll earn in 15-16 based on how they do in 14-15. So the district adopts the plan at the beginning of the school year. People qualify during that school year using that plan. And then as they're evaluated at the end of 14-15, those that are effective and highly effective will have salary increases, not the old 5% supplement from before, but an actual base salary increase based on that plan beginning in 15-16. These are the things that you saw in your letter. These were the guiding principles and tenets for today. For this group to understand how teachers are evaluated and make sure that people across the state that we're ensuring a transparent and fair process, provide teachers and principals with meaningful feedback, as the commissioner discussed this morning, and that we have a system to identify, recognize, and reward our highest performing teachers so that all students have access to great teachers. That's the end of it. We made it through all four.
Okay, thank you, Kathy.